This year, we've been pursuing a set of talks which have tried to address the question, how do we live our lives every day as Christians? What are the challenges we face as Christians, and how do we address those? Martin has joked several times that it's a list of his faults. I've no idea why he thinks his faults are necessarily any better than my faults, as it happens, but it's a list of all of our faults. And what I want to do today is try and give you a simple picture which draws together the threads of everything we've done over the last 12 months. And this is a list of the talks that we've had. We started with what's wrong with being self-sufficient. Then Martin talked about what happens when everything goes red. You know, we all face moments when we feel angry. Then we had Russell talking about being authentic, not just at work, but also at home. Then we talked about where is God in my ordinary life, in all the ordinary stuff we do every day, where is God in all of that? And James talks about where does being a Christian make me a softie? And then we looked at whether our prayers are really answered. Martin talked about what happens when you feel humanly selfish, what's going on there. Russell looked at how much are we worth. And then Tash looked at this whole issue of, you know, there are moments when our family doesn't really understand, they don't get us. And then David addressed the challenging subject of what happens when church gets in the way, what happens when church comes between us and God. A hugely interesting and difficult list. Now, one of the great successes of this year has been that we've recorded all of these. Well, we haven't actually. There was one week when it didn't work, and it was utterly my fault. But it was my talk, so it probably doesn't matter so much. But there they all are on YouTube. And you can, if you want to, go back and listen to them. I'm quite surprised. Some of the early ones have got as many as 60 hits. I'm quite impressed by that, really. But they're all there. And actually, when thinking about this morning, I went back and listened to a number of them, actually, to sort of refresh my mind about what they were saying, in particular what they were saying to me. But there we are. This is Claverdon Church catch-up, basically, if you want to go back and find out what went on. Now, I'm well aware of the fact that I can stand at the back of the church and people will say, thank you for that word, and they'll tell me what it meant to them, and it's utterly nothing to do with what I've said. It happens regularly, and it's perfectly okay, because God speaks to people in remarkable ways, despite what we say at the front. But this is, roughly speaking, what those talks said to me. They said these things. Firstly, it's about doing things in God's strength, not our own strength. Secondly, the frustration within us grows into anger if we let it, but actually self-control is part of the fruit of the Spirit. That authenticity is about being genuine, knowing that we're completely accepted by a God who knows everything about us and still accepts us. We're not called to be monks, but we are called to call God into our daily lives. And James's talk, we don't have to be softies because Jesus definitely wasn't one. The Great Commission says, go and make disciples of all nations, but we don't have to be British about the way we set about doing that. Anyone can pray. God gives us the words for us to give back. We act selfishly because we don't know what it means to feel content. God values every one of us as special, and it's up to us to say thanks for the gifts and grace that we receive. And in Tasha's talk, we don't need to be afraid to be different. Actually, we're known by our fruit. And church is about encouraging one another. Now, you might have got a completely different set of things out of those talks, but that's how they spoke to me. And what I want to do is to bring those things together. And the unifying thing that brings all of those thoughts together is grace. And I've spoken on numerous occasions about grace, and I'm going to do it again, but from yet a different perspective to any perspective we've, I think, used before. And I want to start with this little passage from 1 Peter, which says this. Like good stewards of the manifold grace of God, serve one another with whatever gift each of you has received. Whoever speaks must do so as one speaking the very words of God. Whoever serves must do so with the strength that God supplies, so that God may be glorified in all things through Jesus Christ. And I was reflecting on that word manifold, apart from its obvious car engine connotations. The word manifold means multicolored. So we each receive a different colour of grace. I remember talking 2 years ago, I think it was, about grace, saying that God sends it, and that's perfect. We receive it, that's not quite so perfect, and then we dispense it, and that's even less perfect again. And actually it loses efficiency as it goes down through that sort of path. But what it didn't say, it suggested almost that we all receive the same grace, but we don't. The grace we receive is utterly different. It's unique to us. I was thinking this morning in the early morning communion, we talk about the manifold sins and wickedness. In other words, our sins are also unique to us and different. The word means multicolored, it means unique. It means that each one of us gets a different kind of grace. And church is what happens when we bring all of that grace together. Now, I want to share with you a picture that I find useful, and it's called the cycle of grace, and it starts like this. Firstly, grace is about acceptance. And the word acceptable is something that, we always kind of modify the meanings of words over time. And the word acceptable has become to mean just about okay. It's, if you were in Ofsted or something, it's somewhere well below good. It's all right, just about. And in a sense, that's how we use the word. We accept things, we accept situations, we accept people, but we do it in a kind of conditional way. But God doesn't do that. If I behave badly towards somebody, their acceptance of me will be dented by that. But actually, God doesn't do that. God's acceptance of us isn't dented by the things we do. There are lots of passages in the Bible that reinforce that. I'm reminded of one we use at funerals that says, "For I'm convinced that neither death nor life can separate us from the love of God." Even death doesn't separate us from that love of God. It's utterly forever. And that great quote we've often said in these services from Philip Yancey, there's nothing you can do to make God love you more, and there's nothing you can do to make God love you less. It is completely without condition. And again, I'm sure I've said this before, but I remember Lucy Winkett saying, when you stare at the congregation, just look at all the faces and remember that God can't bear to be parted from any one of them. It's that utterly unconditional love. And if you want the real expression of it, go and reread The Prodigal Son. It is the ultimate expression of that completely unconditional love. Well, the issue isn't that God loves us. The question is, do we accept that gift of grace? Are we receiving it, and are we accepting it, and are we changed by it? I heard a story the other day about a vicar who moved into a new vicarage, and a lovely man came along, knocked on his door and said, "I'm just introducing myself. I cut your lawns for you. I cut the grass." And he said, and the vicar said, "Thank you, that's really, really kind. It's lovely, and it's lovely to meet you, and I'm so grateful." And anyway, about a year later, and he was cutting the lawns every week. A year later, the same man knocked on the door and said, "I've just come to tell you I'm retiring. But don't worry, I'm going to carry on cutting your lawns. It'll still be okay. I'm still going to do it. It's just that I'm personally retiring." And the vicar started to be effusive in his thanks again. And the chap said, "No, stop. I don't want any of that. Don't want any thanks. And what's more, if you bring me a bottle at Christmas, I'll stop cutting your lawns." And it was that sense that, some people can't accept grace. They can't accept it. It's somehow it's difficult to receive. And there's a bit of that in all of us that we struggle with. So step one in my cycle is not just, recognizing that God's grace is infinite, but it's actually opening the door and accepting it. Well, the second step in this cycle is, having accepted it, how do we carry on accepting it? How do we sustain ourselves in this journey? And the idea of sustenance is simple, really. If you want to stay in God's grace, you pray, you read the Bible, and you spend time in silence listening to God. There's nothing more complicated than that, really. I always remember Kathy Davis used to say, "I can't get enough of God." She had that sort of passion that, it was just, she just longed for more every day. But the answer is, we have to find a pattern that works for us. And it's different for each of us, just as the grace is different for each of us. And it might be that, the ideal pattern for you is to read the Bible at breakfast, to pray when you're working in the kitchen, and to listen to God in those quiet moments while you're waiting for the children from school. That any such pattern works for you, but that's what we have to work out for each of us. It's about being rather than doing. It's not about actually being an action person. It's just about resting and being in that state of grace. And it's okay if you lapse, to start again. I think part of the journey is about constantly starting again. We all lapse. We all kind of wander. We all lose it a bit. And starting again is all part of that journey of sustenance. If you were to be part of one of those groups like the Northumbria community or the Iona community, they all invent for themselves what they call a rule of life. They're borrowing from the way the monks used to do it. And it's a great way to do it. But actually, rule sounds slightly difficult and oppressive. And, I think for most of us, we want to find something that's rather more of a joy than a burden as we seek to do it. But the answer is we find a way of continuing in that walk with the Lord. You might... that's interesting. I have a feeling what I have here isn't the same as there, Matt, but don't worry. Question. What sustained Jesus? And the answer is, he prayed. He had a close group of supportive friends. He worshipped at the synagogue. He spent time in what people call table fellowship. He ate with other people. He read the scriptures. He spent time on his own. He went for long walks. He appreciated creation. He valued rest and sleep. He welcomed children. And he related to the outcasts of society, and he spoke to absolutely anyone. These were the things that energized and sustained Jesus in his relationship with God. And these are the sorts of things that would energize us in our continuing walk with the Lord. So if we carry on in our little cycle of grace, we come to significance. Significance is answering the question, who am I? And the answer is, I'm someone at this stage who has accepted God's grace and who is attempting to daily walk with him. I don't need job titles, I don't need business cards, I don't need anything else to define me. I'm simply defined by the fact that I'm in that relationship, if you like. If you go back to our talks, it says, I invite the extraordinary Jesus into my ordinary life. It says, I'm not afraid to be different. It says, I know what it is to be content. I'm not defined by some list of achievements or connections or where I live or who I know or where I've been. We simply don't need to define ourselves that way. And it is on that foundation that we get achievement. So it is only now that we begin to focus on what am I called to do. So we go all the way around this circle before we do anything. And you notice that that being comes before doing in this journey. And if I can make this work, you can see that let me go back. Sorry, I've made this complicated for myself. Never mind, we'll get there. Right, we got there. That the acceptance of grace and walking with the Lord is the input, but the significance and the doing is the output in this journey. That's how grace should flow and work in our lives. Let me put it a different way. It's not what we do that determines who we are. It's who we are that determines what we do. I find that a helpful thought. Here's another way of looking at it. I don't know if this will work for you. This is a kind of gardening metaphor, but if you think of that cycle I've got and think of it as a horticultural world, we have planting, the seed, we water and nurture it. Those are the inputs. And then it grows eventually into a recognizable plant. You can know who it is or what sort of plant it is. And finally it bears fruit. But actually in that journey, there's a point somewhere. There it is. Where we've sowed the seed and we've watered it, but it isn't strong enough to grow on its own. It needs a trellis. It needs some support. It needs help. And actually that's what our spiritual kind of stepladder, our spiritual framework, our rule of life is all about. It's helping us with that journey before we grow into that utterly recognizable plant. I don't know if that picture helps. And the Bible tells us often, it reinforces all of these pictures. I am significant. I'm a branch of the true vine. I've been chosen and appointed by God to bear fruit. I'm God's fellow worker. I'm God's workmanship, created for good works. And I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. The Bible reinforces this picture constantly. Well, now, against this picture of grace, the world we live in doesn't look like that at all. The world we live in has some rather different equations, and the equations look like this. They say that our performance and our accomplishments is what makes us significant. And they say that our status and our recognition is our source of security. And they say that our appearance and our admiration is the basis of our acceptance. And all of those, if our performance and accomplishments are the basis of a significance, no wonder some of us feel insignificant. And status and recognition is kind of celebrity, really. Well, that's a pretty fickle business. I'm not sure if it really is security. And appearance and admiration, amazing number of people who are hugely admired talk of being very lonely, interestingly. So the equations don't entirely work, but we live by them nonetheless. That's exactly the way we live. And we don't really approach this cycle the way I suggested at all. What we do is this. We start by pursuing achievements, and we do it in our own strength. So the first thing we do is we go out and try and do stuff, and we try and achieve things, and we collect credits for our CV, we notch up successes of one sort or another. And actually, if I look back, a good chunk of my working life was exactly characterized by this. I did stuff, I did achievements entirely in my own strength, and I brought up my own children to do the same thing. I encouraged them to think exactly the same way. And step 2 says on the basis of all those achievements, you get promotions, recognition, you get status, you get all this good stuff that flows on the back of your achievements, as long as the achievements keep coming. When the achievements dry up, then actually the significance dries up a little bit. Ask any sportsman about that. And step 3 says we are sustained by the continuity of success in all this. Success breeds success. We become driven to even greater achievements, sustained, if you like, by competition. And, they used to say in business, you're only as good as your last success. And finally, we strive for the ultimate goal, which is acceptance, which ironically was the free gift of God's grace that we didn't accept in the first place. And we spend our life striving, so we go all the way around here against the flow, anti-clockwise, around essentially the wrong way, striving to achieve something that was basically free in the first place. And I don't know if I can make this work, but no, I probably can't. Anyway, yes, perhaps I can. Here we go. What's this? Oh no, it didn't work. No. The answer is the inputs and outputs reverse. Anyway, and that the achievement and significance become our inputs, and the sustenance and acceptance become the outputs. And it's like a hamster wheel. We go round and round. There is no escape from it. And it's what some people call functional atheism. It says we believe in God, but actually we behave as if he didn't exist. So people call that functional atheism. And it's a recipe for exhaustion. It's a recipe for depression. It's a recipe for burnout. It's running against the flow of grace. And the picture I'm trying to paint to you is that most of us, for at least part of our lives, are trying to go around the loop anti-clockwise, not clockwise. And God made us to go round clockwise, not anti-clockwise. We had a holiday half term, and I decided to read John's Gospel. And I had this picture in my mind as I was reading John's Gospel. And as I went through it, it kept speaking to me. So here they were. Acceptance. I know you always hear me. Sustenance. I and the Father are one. Status and significance. I am the light of the world. And achievement. The Son can do nothing by himself. This picture kind of reinforced itself as I was reading through John's Gospel. Well, the question is this. If you're going round in the wrong direction, how do you go back the other way? As far as I can see, the only way to solve that is to stop. At some point you have to stop and reverse direction. I can hear my sat-nav saying, perform a legal U-turn. And that's what I'm encouraging you to do, I suppose. I think you have to press pause. If you're going around the wrong way, and for good chunks of my life I'm sure I have and probably still do, you have to press pause to go back and reverse the direction. And you have to pause, I think, to soak on the reality of divine acceptance, that incredible feeling that I can open my heart to a God who loves me even though he knows everything about me. And you pause simply to make time to be with God, not just to chatter to him, but to stop and listen and rest in the presence of God and hear him speak to you. And to walk, therefore, in continuing grace. And to pause to reflect on who you are. I'm not my job title. I'm not where I live. I'm not anything else. I am simply called to be in that relationship with Jesus. And pause to hear God's call on your life. And somehow I think all of us have somehow got to sort of think about how we think positively about going around that loop in that clockwise way. So I invite you this new year, I think it's a great moment to do it as we approach Christmas, New Year, to start that new year recognizing that you are a new creation. And we're going to sing those words in a moment or two, I think. And one last comment from me. Next year, third Sunday, 2014, we're going to be looking at the Ten Commandments. And we will start by asking whether they're still relevant, and then we'll work through the Ten Commandments with the same kind of practical sense we've had this year. We're going to ask the question, how do they apply to our lives in 2014 in a practical way, and how does the Bible help us to see exactly what they mean for us as we go forward? So we'll be looking at the Ten Commandments next year.